people in Silicon Valley are always talking about how to change the world. But in China, it's more about how do we adapt to a changing world? How do we improve our own life? And according to him, that's the main difference. I mean, and we know this stuff is all propaganda, but my gosh, I wish we at least had some better propaganda right now in the U.S. That would get me through this thing.
What are they even saying? My chance to go watch Made in China.
I'm Dan Grover. I'm a product manager in Silicon Valley.
So I hear you used to work in China.
Yes, I spent a few years at Tencent in Guangzhou.
Well, first off, I want to acknowledge that your very occasional blog, dangrover.com, is one of the reasons I thought working at a consumer-facing Chinese tech firm would be a good idea. And so I want to blame you, first off, for wasting 6 months of my life. But secondly, thank you for writing insightful things about something that basically no one covers. So with
Glad
that,
you enjoyed it.
With that, let's jump into this recent piece about the way that Chinese tech companies and their applications have responded to coronavirus domestically in China, contrasting that to the seeming lack of action on the part of Silicon Valley's giants. So first off, let's lay the groundwork of what has been happening and why on the most commonly used apps for hundreds of millions of Chinese nationals. So what were the main UI innovations that struck you on these giant apps?
I think what we're seeing is they've applied a lot of new ideas that have come across in the last few years in Chinese apps really well. And they've made all the various tools that these tech companies are launching to help people deal with the coronavirus. They've managed to put them in a very central way, attract a lot of attention to them, and just really put them to use.
Let's talk about the two ones that you highlighted in this piece. So first were apps that direct people to get care. So what was going on in this area?
Yeah, so there's a few things to look at there. One thing worth pointing out is just the way that the medical system is set up to deal with crises like this. They've got this concept of fever clinics there, which if you're not familiar with it, it's basically a place where you can go if you're not seriously sick, and they will diagnose you and try to figure out what to do with you and kind of isolate you for a while so that you're not going back and potentially spreading the virus to your family. So a lot of these were set up during the SARS epidemic. A bunch more have been set up recently. So one of the things that all the apps did very early on was they just put a map view where you can just go and find the closest one to you, which is definitely very useful if you think that you might be sick. They also had an official list of all of the hospitals that were officially designated to actually deal with the serious cases with ICUs and ventilators and things like that. And those were all in the map views. So this was in WeChat, it was in Baidu, it was in Alipay. They all had these very prominent maps where you could go and figure out where to go. The other thing that's happening is there's all of these telemedicine apps or ventures that are happening. So there's the Ping Hao Yisheng app that had a 10x growth just during the crisis. There's a Tencent health play. There's an Ali health play. So all of these e-health apps kind of took advantage of the crisis and tried to get more people to try their consultation products. So a lot of them were doing free consultations. A lot of them were doing, 1 RMB consultations, and people were going in there and asking, either common things that they would have gone to the doctor for, but are kind of too afraid for because of the epidemic, just like, common colds and rashes and stuff like that. Or they're asking, like, can you diagnose me? Should I go in and get checked out? And that deflected a lot of the load off of the hospital so they could deal with people who were sick. I can tell you my experiences going to the doctor. So after I became a Chinese employee of Tencent, I didn't get to have the fancy expat medical plan, and you just got a health savings account with the special bank card. And I just went to the normal People's Hospital of Guangzhou, and it was set up like a deli. You go in, you get a number, you say, I want to see a dermatologist or whatever it is, and then you take your number and then you go see the doctor. I would say it's not as it's a very quick, casual thing. Thankfully, I never had anything really, really serious happen to me, so I don't know about that. But I would say for all of the sort of common things that I would need to see the doctor for, it was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and I think the other key to this, which presumably is the difference between the U.S. system, is like really straightforward checkup type things in China are paid for out of pocket and are shockingly affordable. So I guess now is as good a time as ever to tell this story. So during my birthday, I had a friend who, this was I think 2 years ago now, I had a friend who shook my hand. He was like, "Happy birthday, Jordan." And I thought it was a little weird he shook my hand, but whatever, this is this guy's thing. So as he's shaking my hand, he notices that there's a bump on my knuckle. And he's like, "What's up with that?" And at first I thought it was, I had just like playing basketball, I'd dislocated my finger or something. So I spent the whole day kind of like pushing it back and forth, and whatever, the bump didn't go away. So by this afternoon, I was sort of freaking out and went to the, I forget which hospital it is. It was like right near Gulo. It was, some very local hospital. I was in the line. I pressed the button. My card didn't have money on it. I didn't have cash. I had to like talk to someone and persuade them to give me cash while I like sent them money on WeChat. And by the time I went through all of this, it was already 4 o'clock, and I had my ticket and I was in line, but they were like, "No, sorry, we're not doing any X-rays for the rest of the day." So, there are 5 other people in line screaming at the person, being like, "Let me do the X-ray. I've been waiting all day." So I figured, all right, this is not going to happen. So, I burned 100 kwai on that ticket. But then I end up going to the like slightly, I think I went to Beijing Union, which was not, it's not like a super fancy like Western private one, but is definitely like a step up from the really local place I went. And my X-ray cost $100. So they scan this thing, and there is one resident who had like halfway decent English, and but before the resident talked to me, they handed me the report in Chinese, and I was going through, and I was trying to decipher it. But as I was doing it, the guy came in and like he just started screaming, "Benign, benign, benign!" Like it was the one, like it was the only word in English he knew. So Athena was getting on the plane, getting like on the tarmac, about to take off on a plane. I sent her the photo of the readout, and she was like, "Jordan, like I really can't talk. It's actually going to break up any second, but like just know you're going to be okay." And then the call cuts out. So anyways, very
Oh
dramatic,
man,
but ultimately positive
so
thing. My
it
little
was
bump is
benign.
gone. Well, I mean, it was still like a bump that I had to get cut out. But yes, it was like some like cartilage growth, and like now I have a cool little scar on my third right
Oh, that's good. It
knuckle.
worked out.
Um, Oh yeah. So, one reason I imagine this sort of telemedicine can get a real push in China in a way that it isn't potentially in the West is because it is so integrated with these platforms. What is it about, Google Health that has failed? And are the current startups sort of lacking in funding to be able to invest in these sorts of things? Like, what do you think was able the Chinese telemedicine to flourish in a way that it doesn't seem like America's has been, at least over the past month?
There is just this thing though where in China there are a lot of there's these conglomerates and they spin up businesses in all sorts of different sectors, and it is, I would say, it's comparatively easy for them to find a reason to promote their, if Alibaba is doing a coronavirus center in all of their apps anyway, you might as well ask the people at Alibaba Health, is there a tie-in we can do to promote this in there, right?
I imagine it's just more tightly integrated systems and companies that are sort of used to working on so many different verticals, and already sort of more already proven that they've been able to make quote super apps.
There's an angle worth covering, which is this: what's happening to the Chinese apps, where they've all kind of developed these inner platforms, these mini program platforms, which have allowed a lot of these first party features as well as third party apps to integrate a lot more smoothly into them.
Totally.
And we definitely saw that at play with some of the features that were launched.
Great. So now coming to the role QR health codes have played in fighting the virus.
We should first talk about how the lockdown was enforced. So in a lot of places, people's apartment complexes would try to keep track of people's health, or they'd keep track of who's coming and going, and give you this like paper passbook to only let you out or over a certain period. A lot of places of employment would do a similar system where they'd have people who would take your temperature, see if you're sick, see where you've been traveling. So this is kind of happening everywhere, and is very inefficient, as you can imagine. So one of the things that came out in, I think, early February in Hangzhou was they created this system where you could generate a QR code for yourself, where you'd put in your ID information, you'd answer a questionnaire about where you've been and what symptoms you have, and it would put you into one of a few buckets. You could be green, which is I'm healthy, I'm good to go. You could be yellow, which means potentially risky, or you could be red, which is like definitely stay at home. And this took off. It got over 1 million QR codes generated in the first couple days after the launch, and it was
Again, this was an
quickly.
Alibaba. This was an Alibaba product created initially locally by the Hangzhou, I think, municipal government,
Yeah,
and Alibaba, who's of course based in Hangzhou, to figure out a way for that city to get back open again.
yeah. So that took off in Hangzhou, and a whole bunch of other cities copied it. So there's one in Shanghai, there's one in Beijing. Everybody's doing these health QR code systems. Some of them are from Ali, so they've just asked Ali, "Hey, can you spin us up one of these?" And then they figure out how to brand it and get people using it. But some of them also were made by Tencent, which very quickly jumped into it. So there are hundreds of these systems by March that had launched. And what eventually happened was the state council decided to make a official national version of this that people could use. And now you can see that's what's being promoted in these apps when it says health QR code.
Yeah. So i- a few things are interesting about this. First, you have this great quote from some government official after Alibaba gave like a few $1 million to the relief efforts. And the guy was like, look, why don't you make some software and actually do something useful? Because like money is not the problem right here. So first off, that's fascinating. My other thought bubble as to why this is something that really took off in China in a way that it hasn't in the US is the fact that like there actually really was a complete lockdown in the first place and you did not see people going out in the street. So, there's an aspect of that which is like a policy decision. There's another aspect of China just being more suited for people to live at home, and the logistics were set up better so that you could actually, a whole country could actually end up ordering all their groceries online. So when you have a real complete lockdown, then your bias is towards everyone to stay in until there's a way to sort of prove you're healthy, as opposed to in the US where like there are no cops putting people in jail because they're going outside. Or even in New York, I was just walking around this past Saturday, April 25th, and there are folks still walking around without masks on. So if that isn't something that, if the sort of baseline is that, I feel like doing the sort of like contract tracing and making people stay at home is just not going to happen. There was some sort of like neighborhood level enforcement that
Yeah.
then they wanted to outsource up, as opposed to in the US, people are talking about, oh, let's do contact tracing or whatever. But like that would actually end up leaving us with a more restrictive system than we have currently, which is hard to think about people getting necessarily on board with. Whereas health QR codes in China were actually a way to sort of release the pressure that people were feeling from their local neighborhood organizations.
Right, right. And it's also like a way to kind of standardize whatever heuristics were being used, because it seems like everybody had their own system for trying to keep people healthy, right? So this thing came out, and I've been reading some of the threads on Juhu, and nobody will really say this is how we decide what category to put you in. Nothing in the official spec tells you how it works. Lots of speculation. It seems like at the bare minimum, what it's doing is looking at your symptoms that you self-reported, and it's starting a counter where basically after 14 days you're safe. It seems that there are some of these systems, there's some other heuristics that are applied. So there are location tracking things that have been launched separately by the phone companies, where you can get kind of an affidavit of where the phone company thinks you've been if you needed to show that to someone. So there's speculation, well, maybe that is being linked in. In the Xinhua editorial I mentioned, they're pointing out that apparently the Shanghai system, they're linking to all these different municipal databases and applying all the stuff. So who knows how much of that is like actually happening, 1984 Big Brother style, and
Yeah.
how much of that is just pure marketing BS. I tend to think a lot of it is the latter. I think a lot of these systems are going to be pretty siloed, and it's going to be very difficult. For launching this thing in a few weeks, I don't think they're joining data from like the hospitals or the phone companies or anything like that. I think that's marketing, but apparently there might be some truth to what had been going on in Shanghai with their system, where they had apparently a pre-existing platform for doing some of this sort of thing. But I would bet the national one isn't doing anything that advanced.
I translated an article which was kind of like walking through the first weeks of the Alibaba team and how they got it to stand up, and just the fact that it sounded so incredibly harried, and they like ended up like using the 60 people who are like locked down in Hubei, who are their engineers, to like make the Wuhan one. It just sounds like the big brother fears of this, at least for the moment, are not necessarily completely baked in. But this is definitely a platform that you can, if you're an authoritarian country, can grow into something that our soft little Western eyes may find very, very uncomfortable. So why don't we do the Trump Google story and why this isn't happening in the US right now? So
I think when I wrote the piece maybe a month ago, I was just impressed with all of the very, very useful features that had been launched in such a short amount of time and surfaced so prominently in the major apps that people were using. And the only thing, when I looked around at the American apps that I'm using, like what have they actually done, right? There's some PSAs that say like, hey, you should wash your hands. There's a couple of places where you can see the stats, which is nice. Then there's that weird press conference where they had all the CEOs, and Trump was like, yeah, Google's going to launch this thing that can help you find a test. And then Google had to backtrack that.
It was remarkable.
It was just such a crazy contrast, because this is supposed to be like the high tech capital of the world, and Google's like, yeah, well, it's only going to be local, and it's not actually us; it's our subsidiary. And actually, I haven't seen this thing come out. Have you seen anything?
No, I mean, I think it came out and it was literally, we were talking earlier about like the where you can get treatment thing. I think it was a map that had three dots on it. It was like the biggest bust of the century. It was really remarkable. So, on the one hand, these companies can say, hey, we don't want to make this like crazy privacy tracking thing. But putting that aside, there's a ton of stuff that can be done that doesn't necessarily get lawyers scared.
Totally. Well, I think like the reason, I think, for the contrast that I just talked about was it seems like the Chinese tech companies' response to this, they're not entirely doing it out of this goody two shoes public goods sort of sentiment like a lot of the US companies are. They're actually trying to make money off this, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So a lot of what you've seen, it's they have business units that are doing health stuff. They're like shit, let's promote this. Let's get people to try teleconsultations. They have their e-commerce divisions. They're like, let's figure out how to ship more masks and make people more confident in the masks that they're buying. They have what else? Then there's the whole mini program angle, where all these things are being used to like acclimate people to using mini programs in Ali and WeChat and things like that. And Tencent even funded a whole bunch of people to go develop apps or mini programs to aid the pandemic. So there's a business angle to this thing that I think the companies there were quick to seize on. And when I look at what's happening here, yes, Silicon Valley companies are trying to figure out how to be helpful, but they're not trying to make money off of it, which I think is the interesting difference.
I think the mainstream Washington consensus would be like, oh, these companies were all forced to do all this stuff by the government, which I think like on some sense, maybe that was the origin of the Alibaba health QR code, but very quickly it became something that was just like another competition between Alibaba and Tencent, where each country wanted their QR code to be the official QR code of, Guangxi or wherever we're talking about.
And there's also like the enterprise software angle to this. So when Ali launched their system, there's an enterprise component of it, because your company was scanning your code when you come in, and that was all done through DingTalk, which is, of course, they're trying to compete with ByteDance and Tencent with their enterprise communication products. So it's also a way to like get more people using these things with that as a selling point.
Is there another aspect of this where just like, Facebook and Google and Twitter are fat and lazy, and Alibaba and Tencent are more hungry and more entrepreneurial and better at like doing things really fast?
After all the time spent in China, I still don't quite understand the source of that. Because from one angle, you could say Alibaba and Tencent are pretty lazy because they, they are entrenched to a certain degree in as Chinese internet companies because they're so good at complying with regulations, because they're insulated to some degree from competition. So you could look at that situation, and you could say why they should be way lazier than Google or Apple or
Yeah.
something, but they're not. And that's always really puzzled to me because they all move very fast. They're doing lots of interesting things.
Are there other reflections you have comparing your time at Tencent and your time in big Silicon Valley?
I guess I would describe like the attitude there. I think people are hungrier um, than we are in Silicon Valley, and it's not a matter of the business itself or like the competition. It's just like there's a the vibe is very different, and I miss that sometimes.
Yeah. Well, the flip side of hunger is like desperation,
Right.
right?
I was reading or trying to read through. There's an official book on Tencent history by Wu Xiaobo called Teng Shunzhuan. In the intro, there's a great quote where he said something to the effect of, people in Silicon Valley are always talking about how to change the world, but in China, it's more about how do we adapt to a changing world, how do we improve our own life, and according to him, that's the main difference, and I like that summation a lot.
There's one other thing I wanted to talk about. I noticed this playing around in the apps too, about how like the like we're all in this together vibe. The only time I really see that is in like terrible television ads or like the YouTube ads that like the special coronavirus YouTube ads or like
Yeah,
now is like a time to connect or whatever. But it did for whatever reason feel much more sincere in the
yeah, I,
Chinese
I don't
apps.
know why that is. And we know that politics there are pretty messy too, and not everybody is united, and there's lots of horrible things happening there. But I kind of admire that, and it made me think of gosh, I think one time, I want to say after my first year in China, I came back to the U.S. to visit some family, and on one part of the trip I was staying in a hotel, and I remember like coming down like my first day back in the US and watching the TV news, eating my continental breakfast. And I think like the election was just starting to heat up, and I just remember feeling so fatigued, even like before Trump was president, at the division and the conflict and having to process all of that and having to decide who's right, which was like a weird thing that's like we're totally used to living here
Yeah.
now, but seemed like a weird reverse culture shock to me then. And I kind of, even though the reality isn't as like buttoned up as it sounds, I like that that the apps, at least, if you look at the messaging, if you look at some of the news that was coming, there's at least the sentiment of like we're all in this together. Let's solve this. Let's kick this thing's ass. That I
Yeah.
I, I kind of wish we had more of here.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, having lived through like, in Chinese app, everyone was like Wuhan Jiao, like Hubei
Yeah,
Jiao. Like I've been in the city that has, been hit with the brunt of this, and like it would be nice if like Twitter said like, "Way to go, New York!" Like hang in there or something. I don't know. That'd like
yeah.
give me a nice
Well,
warm
there
fuzzy
there are a
feeling.
lot of. I mean, and we know this stuff is all propaganda. But my gosh, I wish we at least had some better propaganda right now in the U.S. That would
Yeah,
get me through this thing.
yeah. I mean, honestly, like if we had a different president, I think the tenor would be a lot different, which is really sad. But
I love that
you know,
one moment where, what was it, pretty early on, they had Li Keqiang going out in that supermarket. Well, he was giving this speech about like, hey, we're gonna get through this, and there's a little old lady in front who's just oblivious to the whole thing, who's still like doing her shopping.
yeah, yeah, she's like, I'm just trying to get my tomatoes here. I don't want to deal with this
Yeah,
premier president. I don't even know what his title is. What is Lika Chan? He
yeah,
went to Beijing or something.
yeah.
Anyways, so we know that Satya Nadella, Jack Dorsey, et al. Are all listening to China Talk. So Dan, do you have a takeaway message about what American tech firms should be learning for Chinese ones as we try to fight our way through this virus?
I wouldn't be too hard on them now. I was pretty hard in the article. I think these companies have stepped up in a lot of important ways since then. I think the takeaway I would find from this is can you find ways to serve people in a crisis like this, but in a sustainable way where it also makes sense for you as a business, because then you're going to be able to do more of that and you're going to be able to be more useful than if you just sort of wall something off and say this is a public good project. Like find ways to genuinely improve people's lives while also having it be a part of your business.
Dan Grover, thanks so much for being a part of China Talk.